I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who betrayed someone she loved. But here I am, telling my story, knowing full well that I was the one who crossed the line. And the worst part, I didn't even regret it. It started off innocently enough. My boyfriend, Eric, and I had been together for 3 years. We had a comfortable relationship, stable and predictable. I knew he loved me, and I loved him too, or at least I thought I did. But then there was Nathan, his younger brother. Nathan had always been different from Eric. Where Eric was serious, Nathan was carefree. Where Eric planned everything in advance, Nathan lived in the moment. He was charming, confident, and had this effortless way of making me laugh, even on my worst days. I never paid much attention to it at first, it was just harmless fun. But then, things changed. It started with small things. Lingering eye contact across the dinner table, the way his hand would brush against mine just a little too long when passing me something. The way he'd say things that were just on the edge of inappropriate, his voice dripping with something I tried so hard to ignore. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overanalyzing things, but deep down, I knew better. One night, Eric had to leave town for work, and I found myself alone in the apartment we shared. Nathan came over under the pretense of keeping me company, bringing a bottle of wine and that devilish grin of his. We sat on the couch, drinking and laughing, and for the first time, I let myself acknowledge the tension between us. "I think about you sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have stopped him, I should have told him it was wrong, but instead, I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "You shouldn't," I murmured, though there was no conviction behind my words. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my skin. "But I do," he said, and then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, his lips were on mine. It was electric, forbidden, and I wanted more. The second time it happened, I had no excuse. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't caught up in the moment. I was fully aware of what I was doing, and I did it anyway. Eric had left for another business trip, and Nathan knew exactly when to show up. This time, there was no pretending. No games. The second I opened the door, he pulled me against him, his lips crashing against mine with a hunger that matched my own. We didn't even make it to the couch. He lifted me onto the kitchen counter, his hands exploring my body as if he'd been starving for me. My breath hitched as he whispered my name, his voice thick with desire. "We shouldn't be doing this," I gasped, even as I tangled my fingers in his hair, pulling him closer. "But we are," he murmured against my skin, his lips trailing down my neck. Every touch sent a thrill through me. Every stolen moment made me crave him more. And when we finally gave in completely, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts, just raw, unfiltered passion. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in my bed, reality started to creep back in. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. It wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was something else entirely. Nathan traced lazy circles on my back, his voice low and teasing. "So, do we pretend this never happened, or do we see where this goes?" I didn't answer right away, because deep down, I already knew. I wasn't going to stop. I told myself it would just be once. A single night of reckless abandon, a moment of weakness I could shove deep into the shadows of my conscience and pretend never happened. But that was a lie. The more I tried to push Nathan away, the more he pulled me back in. Every glance, every lingering touch, every whispered tease only made me crave him more. I became reckless. We both did. Eric remained oblivious, trusting as ever, his faith in me unwavering. And maybe that's what made it so easy to keep doing it, because he never suspected a thing. The next time it happened, it was different. There was no pretense, no excuse. I had spent the day with Eric, playing the perfect girlfriend, and by the time he kissed me goodnight and left for his overnight shift, I was already pulling out my phone to text Nathan. He was at my door within minutes. This time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't tell him we should stop. I didn't pretend to feel guilt. The moment he stepped inside, my hands were on him, my lips devouring his. We barely made it to the bedroom. Clothes were lost along the way, his mouth trailing fire across my skin. It was desperate and needy, our bodies tangled in sheets that still smelled of Eric. And I didn't care. In the aftermath, As we lay there catching our breath, Nathan chuckled, fingers tracing lazy circles on my stomach. "You're addicted to me," he murmured, his voice laced with smug satisfaction. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was just an escape, but the words died on my lips. Because deep down, I knew he was right. The affair didn't stop there. If anything, it escalated. We got sloppy, reckless. We took risks we had no business taking. Quick stolen moments in Eric's own home, secret rendezvous at hotels, whispered phone calls in the dead of night. I convinced myself that as long as Eric never found out, no one was getting hurt. But secrets like this don't stay buried forever, and I was about to learn that the hard way. I had convinced myself that we were untouchable, that as long as we were careful, as long as we played our parts well, no one would ever know. But lies have a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly you try to weave them together. It started with small things. Eric noticed I was distracted more often. My phone, once something I barely paid attention to, now never left my side. He started asking questions. Nothing too direct, just small inquiries, where I'd been, why I was out late, who I was texting. I always had an answer, always a plausible excuse, but I could feel the suspicion creeping into his voice. And then came the moment when everything fell apart. It was a Saturday night. Eric had planned a dinner with his family, his parents, his sister, and of course, Nathan. I told myself I could handle it, that I could sit across from Nathan and act like everything was normal. But the second our eyes met, I felt my breath hitch. He smirked just slightly, and I knew he was enjoying this game far too much. Dinner dragged on. The tension between us was suffocating, an unspoken secret pressing down on both of us. And then, Eric excused himself to grab a bottle of wine from the kitchen. I followed, needing a moment away from the table, needing air. I was standing at the counter when I felt Nathan's presence behind me, too close. His breath brushed against my neck as he whispered, "You're nervous." I shivered, "Not here." He chuckled, afraid someone will notice. Before I could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "What the hell is going on?" I turned to see Eric standing in the doorway, the wine bottle forgotten in his hand. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were locked onto us with an intensity that made my stomach drop. Silence stretched between us. My mind raced for an excuse, a way out, but there was nothing. The way we stood, the look on my face, Nathan's proximity, it told Eric everything he needed to know. "Eric," I started, but he shook his head, his expression darkening. "How long?" His voice was eerily calm, but I could hear the crack in it, the betrayal laced within each syllable. I swallowed hard, but before I could even think of a response, Nathan spoke. "It doesn't matter." My head snapped toward him, horror creeping into my chest. What was he doing? Eric let out a hollow laugh, nodding to himself. Of course it doesn't matter to you." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I should have followed him. I should have said something, begged for forgiveness, tried to explain. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen in place, as the weight of my choices came crashing down. And just like that, the secret we had fought so hard to keep was no longer a secret at all. Eric didn't come home that night, or the next. I called him, texted, even drove to his office, but he was gone. Disappeared into the silence, leaving me alone with nothing but my own thoughts and the suffocating weight of what I had done. Nathan tried to reach out. He called, sent messages, but I ignored them all. The thrill, the excitement, it had vanished the second Eric's eyes had locked onto mine in that kitchen. Now, all that remained was the cold, gut-wrenching reality of what I had lost. Days passed in a blur. I went through the motions of work, pretending like I wasn't completely unraveling inside. The apartment felt empty without him, the bed too big, the silence too loud. I hadn't cried yet. I wasn't sure I was allowed to. Then, a week later, Eric came home. I was on the couch when I heard the door unlock. My breath caught in my throat as he stepped inside, looking exhausted, disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't speak at first. Just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Where have you been?" My voice barely came out, weak and hoarse. "Does it matter?" he shot back, his tone colder than I had ever heard it before. I flinched, but I deserved it. "Eric, please." "Save it." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You know, I spent the last week trying to figure out how I didn't see it, how I let myself believe you actually loved me. My stomach twisted. I did love you, I do. No, his voice was firm, absolute. You don't get to say that. Silence stretched between us, thick with everything we weren't saying. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, as if steadying himself before his next words. I'm leaving. My heart clenched. Eric, wait. I already packed some things. I'll get the rest later. He started toward the bedroom, but then stopped, turning back to me. You and Nathan, was it worth it? I opened my mouth, but no words came out, because I didn't know the answer. He nodded as if that told him everything he needed to know, then walked away. A few moments later, the door shut behind him, and just like that, he was gone. That was the moment the reality of it all finally hit me. And for the first time since this entire thing started, I let myself cry. The days after Eric left were a blur. I barely ate, barely slept. Every corner of the apartment reminded me of him, of us. The empty side of the bed, the jacket he'd forgotten on the back of the chair, the way the air still smelled faintly like him. It was unbearable. Nathan kept calling. At first, I ignored him. But on the third day, after staring at my phone for what felt like an eternity, I answered. You finally picking up, he said, his voice soft, almost cautious. I swallowed the lump in my throat. What do you want? I want to see you. My fingers tightened around the phone. Nathan, I don't think. Just talk to me, please. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When I opened the door, he was already there, leaning against the frame, looking like he hadn't slept much either. His usual cocky smirk was gone, replaced with something that looked a lot like guilt. You okay? He asked. I let out a bitter laugh. Do I look okay? He didn't answer, just stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything pressing down on us. I didn't mean for this to happen like this, he finally said. But it did. My voice was quiet, tired, and now Eric's gone. Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I know, and I hate that, but I don't regret being with you. I should have been angry at him for saying that, but the truth was, a part of me didn't regret it either. That night, we didn't touch. We didn't kiss. We just sat there, side by side, lost in the mess we had created. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt something other than guilt. I felt relief. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself drifting through life in a haze. The apartment felt empty without Eric, but the guilt that had once gnawed at me was beginning to dull, replaced with something else, something I wasn't ready to name. Nathan became a constant presence. At first, it was just check-ins, brief conversations that always felt like they were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. But soon, he stopped waiting for an invitation. He showed up unannounced, bringing food, keeping me company in the long, quiet nights that stretched between me and my regrets. One evening, after a long silence, Nathan spoke. I don't think he's coming back. I stiffened. I know. And what does that mean for us? His voice was cautious, as if he was afraid of the answer. I didn't know. I hadn't allowed myself to think about it. The idea of Nathan and me, together, openly, felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff, uncertain whether I'd crash or fly. Instead of answering, I stood and walked to the window, staring at the city lights below. I don't want to be alone. Nathan came up behind me, his warmth pressing against my back. Then don't be. I turned to face him, searching his eyes for something. Certainty, assurance, a sign that this wasn't just another mistake. His gaze was steady, unwavering. And then, for the first time since Eric left, I allowed myself to stop thinking. I reached for Nathan, and he met me halfway, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was neither rushed nor desperate. It was slow, deliberate, like we had all the time in the world to figure out what this was. The next morning, I woke up beside him, tangled in sheets that no longer smelled like Eric. And I didn't feel guilty at all. The whispers started before I even noticed them. Friends, acquaintances, even people I barely knew suddenly seemed to have an opinion about my life. The way they looked at me, some with pity, others with judgment, told me they knew, or at least they suspected. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it didn't matter, but it did. One afternoon, I was sitting in a cafe when my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Does Eric know yet? He will soon. My stomach clenched. My first instinct was to assume it was a cruel prank, but deep down I knew better. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting for this to explode. That night when Nathan came over, I showed him the message. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening. "What do we do?" I asked. "Nothing," he said firmly. "Whoever sent this just wants to scare you. We don't give them that power." I nodded, but unease settled in my chest. A few days later, I found out who it was. Eric's sister, Madison, showed up at my door, her face a mask of barely contained rage. "You're disgusting," she spat the moment I opened it. "Madison, don't try to explain. Do you even understand what you've done? You destroyed him, and for what? Some cheap fling with his own brother." Her voice wavered, but her anger held firm. "It's not," I started, but the words died in my throat. Because what could I say? That I didn't mean to, that it wasn't supposed to happen. None of it would change what I had done. She shook her head, stepping back. "You don't deserve him, and I hope when this all blows up, you realize exactly how much you've lost." I watched her walk away, my body frozen, my mind racing. Because she was right. The storm was coming, and I wasn't ready for it. The storm didn't wait, it hit fast and hard. 2 days after Madison's visit, Eric showed up at my door. It was late, past midnight, but the urgency in his knock sent my heart into a panic. When I opened the door, he stood there, his face pale, his eyes red. He had been drinking. "Tell me it's not true," he said, his voice hoarse, shaking. I couldn't. I opened my mouth, but no words came out, because what was there to say? He let out a hollow laugh, stepping inside uninvited. I didn't want to believe it. Even when Madison told me, even when I saw the way people looked at me, I told myself it was a mistake, that you wouldn't do this to me, that my own brother wouldn't do this to me. I swallowed hard. "Eric, Shut up," his voice cracked, and for the first time in years I saw him cry. "How long?" Tears burned my own eyes. It wasn't planned. "How long?" he shouted, his fists clenched at his sides. I hesitated, but there was no point in lying now. "A few months." He exhaled sharply, like the wind had been knocked out of him. His whole body trembled as he ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare. "I loved you," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "I would have done anything for you." Guilt pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. "I never meant to hurt you." He scoffed. "But you did. And now I have to live with the fact that the two people I trusted most in this world betrayed me." A long silence stretched between us. Then, finally, he straightened, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I just needed to hear it from you." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused. "You and Nathan, you think this is going to end well? You think you'll be happy?" I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure I even knew the answer myself. And then, without another word, he walked away, leaving the door open behind him. As if inviting me to walk through it, back to the life I had shattered, but I didn't move. I just stood there, watching him disappear into the night. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the same spot, staring at the open door, half expecting Eric to come back. But he didn't, and deep down, I knew he never would. The next morning, Nathan showed up. I hadn't called him, hadn't told him what had happened, but he must have known. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, his gaze scanning my face. He was here, wasn't he? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I figured it was only a matter of time. How bad was it? Bad, my voice cracked, the exhaustion seeping into every syllable. He's gone, Nathan, for good. Nathan exhaled, stepping closer, but I took a step back. The space between us felt heavier than ever. He noticed, his expression darkening. Do you regret it? I looked away. I don't know. Silence stretched between us. For the first time, I really looked at Nathan, not as the exciting, dangerous escape he had been, but as the person standing in the wreckage with me. And I realized something terrifying. This wasn't what I wanted. I had ruined my relationship, burned every bridge, and for what? A fleeting thrill? A fantasy that crumbled the moment it became real. I need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Take all the time you need, but don't pretend this didn't mean something. I didn't answer, because maybe for a moment it had meant something, but now it felt like the biggest mistake of my life. When he left, I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just sat there, staring at the pieces of a life I had shattered, knowing I had no one to blame but myself. A year later, everything was different. I moved out of the apartment, away from the ghosts of my past. A new city, a new job, a fresh start. It wasn't easy. At first, I woke up every day with a weight in my chest, replaying every decision that had led me here. But slowly, I learned to live with it, to accept it. Eric never reached out. I never expected him to. From what I heard through mutual friends, he was doing well. He had moved on, found someone else. He was happy. And that was something I had no right to disrupt. As for Nathan, I hadn't spoken to him in months. Whatever we had, whatever connection we thought was real, had faded the moment the truth came crashing down. And I was okay with that. One evening, as I sat in a quiet cafe, sipping coffee and watching the world pass by, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. I had made mistakes. I had destroyed things I could never rebuild. But life kept moving, and somehow I had learned to move with it. I wasn't defined by my past anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.